Some engines are remembered for their power, their reliability, or their revolutionary technology. Others are remembered for the headaches they caused, the money they cost, and the trust they destroyed. These are the engines that made mechanics curse, fleet managers panic, and drivers question their career choices. They weren't necessarily bad engines in every respect. Many had solid mechanical foundations or innovative features, but they earned their reputations through a combination of poor timing, flawed execution, and real-world problems that turned daily operation into a nightmare. The Freightliner Mercedes-Benz MBE 4000 occupies a unique position in trucking history, not quite hated enough to be legendary, but problematic enough to be remembered with frustration. Originally developed and built by Mercedes-Benz in Mannheim as the OM 460 for global use, it was later adapted for Daimler's North American operations under the MBE 4000 name. Used in Freightliner Columbia highway tractors and M2112 vocational trucks, mainly in the mid-2000s, it coexisted with the Series 60 during the 2000s, before Daimler consolidated under the Detroit DD platform. The 12.8-liter inline-six produced respectable power and torque figures, and its advanced fuel injection system was ahead of many domestic competitors. The problems weren't catastrophic failures or design disasters. They were death by 1,000 cuts. Operators reported cooling system sensitivity, hose failures, and heat soak issues under heavy vocational use. The engine's European heritage meant that parts availability and service expertise were limited compared to established American brands. Mechanics familiar with Caterpillar or Cummins engines found themselves struggling with unfamiliar diagnostic procedures and hard-to-source components. More frustrating was the engine's packaging. Mercedes-Benz designed the MBE 4000 for European truck configurations, and adapting it to American chassis created accessibility issues. Routine maintenance that took an hour on a Cummins might take 3 hours on an MBE 4000 simply because components were harder to reach or required special tools. The MBE 4000 worked acceptably under normal conditions, but problems were expensive and time-consuming to fix. Independent repair shops often refused to work on them, forcing operators to rely on dealer networks that weren't always convenient or cost-effective. The industry fallout was gradual rather than dramatic. After 2009, Detroit Diesel continued limited parts support for a few years before winding down the program. Daimler didn't abandon it due to massive failures or lawsuits. It simply became clear that the North American market preferred engines designed specifically for North American conditions. The MBE 4000 faded from prominence as Freightliner focused on other powerplant options, leaving behind a reputation as a decent engine hampered by poor market fit. The Cummins ISX presents a more complex story because the hatred wasn't directed at the engine itself, but at the emissions equipment bolted to it. Developed in the late 1990s and brought into full production for 2001, the ISX replaced the N14 and became the foundation for all subsequent heavy-duty Cummins platforms. The ISX's mechanical foundation was solid. Cummins had decades of experience with large displacement inline-six engines, and the ISX delivered the power and torque that Class 8 operators demanded. The problem was timing and the rapid evolution of emissions technology. When the EPA's 2007 emissions regulations took effect, engine manufacturers scrambled to meet dramatically reduced particulate matter limits. The CM870, 2003 to 2006, used EGR-only, while the CM871, 2007 to 2009, added a DPF before Cummins added SCR, starting with the ISX-15, introduced for the 2010 model year. The pre-SCR versions combined exhaust gas recirculation with diesel particulate filters, technologies that worked in laboratory conditions but proved problematic in real-world trucking applications. The EGR system recirculated exhaust gases back into the combustion chamber to reduce peak temperatures and limit NOx formation. This worked for emissions compliance, but heavy EGR rates increased soot loading in certain duty cycles, especially low-speed or regional applications. The diesel particulate filter had to capture this soot and required periodic regeneration cycles to burn it off. These cycles became the source of endless frustration. Drivers found themselves dealing with frequent active regenerations that required maintaining highway speeds for extended periods. City drivers, regional haulers, and vocational operators discovered that their duty cycles didn't allow for complete regeneration, leading to clogged filters and reduced power. The regeneration process consumed fuel and generated extreme heat, stressing components throughout the exhaust system. Temperature sensors, pressure sensors, and NOx sensors failed regularly due to the harsh operating environment. Each failure triggered cascades of fault codes and reduced engine power that often required expensive dealer visits for diagnosis and repair. Oil change intervals shortened as fuel dilution and soot contamination increased, driving up operating costs. The frustration was amplified by the contrast with pre-emissions ISX engines, which had earned reputations for reliability and straightforward maintenance. Operators who had been loyal to Cummins for decades suddenly found themselves dealing with complex electronic systems and frequent service interruptions. The engine underneath remained fundamentally sound, but the emissions equipment made daily operation unpredictable. Despite the problems, many operators stuck with the ISX because they trusted the underlying Cummins engineering. The company worked continuously to improve the emissions systems, and the transition to SCR technology with the ISX-15 in 2010 addressed many of the early issues. The ISX's reputation recovered somewhat as the industry adapted to emissions-era realities, but the 2007 to 2009 models remain a cautionary tale about the challenges of integrating new technology under regulatory pressure. While Cummins managed to recover, Caterpillar went in the opposite direction, doubling down on complexity. Caterpillar's ACERT C13 represents one of the most ambitious attempts to solve emissions challenges through pure engineering innovation, and one of the most spectacular failures to achieve market acceptance. Caterpillar had dominated the heavy-duty engine market for decades, and the company was determined to maintain that position through the emissions transition using its advanced combustion emissions reduction technology. Initially designed to meet 2004 and 2007 standards without SCR, ACERT ultimately reached its technological limits before the 2010 cycle. The ACERT strategy was elegant in theory. Instead of relying heavily on exhaust after-treatment, Caterpillar would control emissions through precise combustion management. The C13 used a series sequential twin turbocharger system, not a true compound setup, using electronic control to manage transition between the small and large units, advanced fuel injection timing, and high levels of exhaust gas recirculation. The goal was to reduce NOx formation during combustion while maintaining the power and fuel economy that customers expected. The C13's twin turbo system used a smaller turbocharger for low-end response and a larger one for high-end power, with electronic controls managing the transition between them. The EGR system operated at much higher rates than competitors, requiring massive cooling capacity and precise temperature control. Electronic actuators precisely controlled fuel injection and air management events, and later ACERT versions included electronically controlled intake valve actuators for timing adjustment. When everything worked correctly, the C13 could deliver impressive performance. But everything working correctly became increasingly rare as mileage accumulated. The high EGR rates that enabled emissions compliance also created massive soot loading throughout the engine and exhaust system. Oil change intervals shortened dramatically as soot contamination overwhelmed filtration systems. EGR coolers and ARD combustion systems failed regularly and expensively. When EGR coolers failed, they often dumped coolant into the exhaust system, creating secondary problems throughout the after-treatment system. The twin-turbo system proved fragile in real-world conditions. The electronic actuators that controlled turbo operation were sensitive to heat and vibration, leading to erratic boost control and reduced power. Diagnosing turbo system problems required specialized equipment and extensive training that many independent shops lacked. Fleet mechanics began to dread C13 repairs. The engine's complexity meant that simple problems often required extensive diagnostic time, and parts costs were significantly higher than competitive engines. The twin-turbo system alone could cost more to repair than an entire engine overhaul on simpler designs. As fleets lost confidence, many shifted to competing engines in new truck orders. Used truck values for C13-equipped vehicles dropped as buyers recognized the potential for high operating costs. Independent repair shops, frustrated by the diagnostic complexity and parts costs, began steering customers towards simpler alternatives. The ACERT C13's reputation became so problematic that it contributed to Caterpillar's decision to exit the on-highway engine market entirely. Caterpillar's exit stemmed from cumulative ACERT challenges, especially with the C15, and the company's refusal to invest in SCR adoption. Volvo took a different approach, adapting European technology for American conditions, but the integration proved more challenging than expected. The Volvo D13 entered the North American market with high expectations and European credentials, but the early emissions-era versions quickly earned a reputation for electronic complexity and diagnostic nightmares. The D13 entered North America in the late 2000s to meet 2007 emissions standards, gradually replacing the D12 in Volvo's North American lineup with US-specific EGR and after-treatment systems. Although Volvo engineered a US-specific variant, the software and emissions integration proved more complex than anticipated, especially during initial 2007 to 2009 implementations. The D13's mechanical foundation was sound. The 12.8-liter inline-six featured modern common rail fuel injection, efficient combustion chamber design, and robust construction that promised long service life. Volvo's engineers had optimized the engine for fuel economy and smooth power delivery, characteristics that appealed to long-haul operators focused on operating costs. The problems emerged when the D13 was integrated with North American emissions equipment. The result was a complex web of sensors, actuators, and control modules that frequently conflicted with each other. Diagnostic technicians reported error codes that appeared and disappeared without apparent cause, making troubleshooting extremely difficult. The D13's control systems were more integrated than competitive engines. A failure in one system could cascade through multiple others. A simple sensor failure might trigger fault codes in the engine management, transmission control, and after-treatment systems simultaneously. The regeneration system proved particularly problematic. The D13 often triggered more frequent regenerations in low-load applications, leading to frequent active regenerations that interrupted normal operation. Drivers complained about unexpected power reductions and forced regeneration cycles that occurred at inconvenient times. The regeneration process itself was sensitive to operating conditions, often failing to complete in stop-and-go traffic or low-load applications. Injector cup leaks plagued early D13s from 2007 through 2013. Fleet mechanics found the D13 frustrating to service. Diagnostic procedures that took minutes on competitive engines could take hours on the D13 due to the complexity of the electronic systems. In some regions, independent shops found Volvo and Mack dealer support, and parts flow slower than more common Cummins or Detroit diesel platforms. Repair costs were consistently higher than alternatives, both due to parts prices and extended diagnostic time. Independent shops could service D13s, but often avoided them due to time-intensive diagnostics and limited software access. This forced operators to rely on dealer networks for service, increasing costs and reducing flexibility. Fleet operators who experimented with D13-powered trucks often returned to more familiar alternatives for subsequent purchases. Used truck values for D13-equipped vehicles suffered as buyers recognized the potential for higher operating costs and service complexity. Volvo worked aggressively to address the D13's reputation problems, releasing numerous software updates and hardware revisions. Later versions of the engine resolved many of the early issues, but the damage to the D13's reputation was already done. The engine that was supposed to showcase European sophistication instead became a cautionary tale about the challenges of adapting foreign designs to American conditions. But none of these engines generated the industry-wide catastrophe that followed Navistar's radical gamble. The Navistar MaxxForce 13 stands alone in the pantheon of hated engines, not just for its technical failures, but for the unprecedented legal and financial consequences that followed. No other engine in trucking history has generated more lawsuits, cost more money in settlements, or destroyed more trust between a manufacturer and its customers. Navistar's strategy for EPA 2010 compliance, implemented between 2010 and 2013, centered on advanced EGR without SCR. While competitors were adding diesel exhaust fluid systems to meet the new emission standards, Navistar believed it could achieve compliance through advanced exhaust gas recirculation alone. The MaxxForce 13 used very high EGR rates, significantly higher than earlier engines, combined with sophisticated combustion management to reduce NOx emissions without the complexity and cost of SCR systems. The company marketed this approach aggressively, promising customers that they could avoid the expense and operational complexity of DEF systems. Fleet managers were attracted to the idea of simpler operation and lower fluid costs. Navistar's reputation for innovative engineering, built over decades of generally successful products, gave customers confidence in the new approach. The reality was catastrophic. The MaxxForce 13's extreme EGR rates created soot production levels that overwhelmed every other system in the engine. The diesel particulate filter, designed to handle normal soot loads, tended to clog far sooner than expected, sometimes within a few thousand miles of operation. Regeneration cycles that should have occurred every few hundred miles were happening every few dozen miles, sometimes continuously. The regeneration process itself became a nightmare for operators. Active regenerations required maintaining highway speeds for extended periods, something impossible for many vocational and regional applications. When regenerations failed to complete, which happened frequently, the engine would derate power progressively until it became undrivable. The EGR system, operating at unprecedented rates, created extreme thermal stress throughout the engine. EGR coolers often failed, leaking coolant into intake or exhaust passages. This sometimes caused hydrolock or damaged after-treatment components. The high soot levels contaminated engine oil so quickly that oil change intervals shortened from 25,000 miles to as little as 5,000 miles in some applications. Turbochargers, subjected to extreme heat and soot loading, failed at alarming rates. The variable geometry turbo systems, essential for managing the high EGR rates, proved fragile and expensive to repair. When turbos failed, they often sent debris through the intake system, causing secondary damage throughout the engine. The diagnostic complexity was overwhelming. The MaxxForce 13's control systems generated hundreds of fault codes, many of which were false positives or symptoms of other problems. Technicians reported spending days diagnosing problems that turned out to be caused by the fundamental design flaws rather than specific component failures. Fleet operators found themselves trapped in a cycle of constant repairs and downtime. Trucks that should have been generating revenue were spending weeks at dealerships for repeated attempts to fix the same problems. The MaxxForce 13's reputation became so toxic that some fleets refused to accept trucks equipped with the engine, even when offered significant discounts. Navistar's warranty costs exploded as the company attempted to address the widespread failures. Dealers, overwhelmed by warranty claims and frustrated customers, began losing confidence in the manufacturer. Fleet customers, facing massive unexpected operating costs, began demanding compensation for lost revenue and increased maintenance expenses. Class action lawsuits were filed on behalf of fleet operators, truck owners, and dealers. The lawsuits alleged that Navistar knew the MaxxForce 13 was fundamentally flawed but continued to market and sell the engines anyway. Internal company documents revealed during litigation showed that Navistar engineers had identified the soot production problems early in development, but were pressured to proceed with production to meet regulatory deadlines. In 2022, Navistar paid $52 million in civil penalties and $125 million in mitigation costs to settle Federal Clean Air Act claims. The company also faced billions in additional settlements with customers and dealers. Industry analysts estimate Navistar's total costs, including settlements and warranty expenses, approached $3 billion, making it one of the most expensive product failures in automotive history. The technical failure was compounded by Navistar's initial refusal to acknowledge the problems. Company executives continued to defend the EGR-only strategy even as evidence of widespread failures mounted. This damaged trust between Navistar and its customers in ways that went far beyond the technical issues with the engines themselves. Navistar's market share in Class 8 trucks plummeted from over 20% to near 10% within a few years. Dealers defected to other manufacturers, and fleet customers who had been loyal to International trucks for decades switched to competitors. The company's stock price collapsed, and its survival as an independent entity remained in doubt until its later turnaround and eventual acquisition by Traton in 2021. The MaxxForce 13's failure forced Navistar to abandon its EGR-only strategy and adopt SCR technology like its competitors. The company introduced new engines using proven after-treatment systems, but rebuilding trust with customers proved far more difficult than redesigning the engines. The MaxxForce name became so toxic that Navistar retired it entirely, rebranding its engines under different designations. The industry-wide repercussions were equally significant. The MaxxForce failure demonstrated the risks of pursuing radically different approaches to emissions compliance without adequate real-world testing. Other manufacturers who had been considering alternative strategies accelerated their adoption of proven SCR technology. Navistar's case raised awareness and contributed to more rigorous EPA real-world testing oversight. The MaxxForce 13's legacy extends beyond its technical failures to fundamental questions about corporate responsibility and customer trust. The engine's problems weren't just engineering mistakes, they were the result of corporate decisions to prioritize regulatory compliance and competitive advantage over customer satisfaction and product reliability.